She wasn't trying to survive the blizzard. She was building her own coffin. On the frozen tundra trail, with the world erased by whiteout and nothing but a sled and a dog beside her, Laura overturned the sled, stacked blocks of snow around herself like a grave, and lay down inside to wait for death. But the technique she used didn't come from the settler world that had always mocked her. It was ancient knowledge passed down from her Inuit grandmother, knowledge her village had called savage. 6 days later, when rescuers finally broke through the drift, they expected to recover a frozen body. Instead, they found a woman who had turned a snow coffin into a sanctuary. This was Laura, born in the twilight of a frontier that rewarded conformity above all else. She was the granddaughter of an Inuit woman, a woman whose knowledge of ice and wind had been passed down like a forbidden language through the whispers of a small, scornful settlement. Laura was traveling alone across the tundra, hauling supplies to a remote homestead, when the sky turned white and the world disappeared behind a wall of frozen silence. The blizzard erased every landmark, every path, every chance of rescue. No one expected her to live through the night, let alone 6. But inside that whirling tomb, Laura reached back through the ridicule and found her grandmother's voice. And what she built in the snow would defy every assumption the frontier held about survival. She was born in the shadow of a faith that mistrusted anything it could not name. The settlement sat at the edge of the frontier, a raw collection of plank houses and hard faces, where certainty was a kind of currency. Everyone knew who was one of them and who was not. Laura's grandmother was not. Her name was Anana, and she had come to this place as a bride, traded into a marriage with a French trader who promised her father blankets and powder. When the trader died of fever 3 years later, Anana became a widow in a town that had never wanted her in the first place. She spoke a language they mocked, wore sealskin boots they called barbaric, and carried in her hands a knowledge of the cold that they dismissed as superstition. But to Laura, a small girl with her grandmother's dark eyes, that knowledge was the only real magic she ever saw. Anana taught her that snow is alive. Not dead water, not frozen sky. It breathes, it shifts, it hardens under pressure, and it can be shaped into a fortress if you understand its pulse. She taught her that the coldest wind is not the one that screams, but the one that moves so slowly it steals warmth without a sound. She taught her to build a snow shelter using only a knife and her own body heat, packing blocks into a dome that could stand against 40 below gales for days. She called it in her language the protecting hollow. The town called it nonsense. The women at the general store pulled their children away when Anana spoke. The men spat tobacco juice and muttered that only a savage would trust a house made of ice. But Laura listened anyway. She watched her grandmother's wrinkled hands carve a breathing hole with the care of a sculptor, and she memorized every word, not knowing that one day those words would be the only thing between her and an early grave. By the time Laura was 28, she had buried Anana behind the little cabin with a wooden cross that the preacher insisted on, even though her grandmother had never understood the point of planting a dead tree over a body. The town did not mourn. They simply erased her, as if a woman who had once walked through a blizzard in nothing but caribou fur had never existed at all. Laura, however, kept the knowledge like a forbidden flame. She still heard her grandmother's voice when the north wind rattled the shutters, still felt the ghost of those lessons in her fingers when she shaped dough or carved kindling, but she never spoke of them aloud. The frontier was a place where a woman's reputation could be destroyed by a whisper, and Laura had already been marked by blood. So she packed the knowledge deep inside, and she tried to belong. That winter, her husband Elias was away, working a logging claim 2 territories distant. Laura had been alone before, but this time was different. A message had arrived through a passing trapper. Someone had spotted sickness in the Ashby homestead, a family of 5 huddled in a drafty cabin 50 miles down the Tundra trail. The nearest doctor was 2 weeks away. Laura had a small sack of dried herbs and a jar of fever powder that Anana had brewed years earlier from willow bark and something else she never named. She knew she could help. But the trail was dangerous in late autumn, notorious for sudden whiteouts that could swallow a traveler in minutes. The men at the trading post told her to wait. Wait for a guide, wait for better weather, wait for a sign that God had not abandoned prudent women. Laura nodded, went home, packed her sled, and left before dawn the next day. She would not wait while children burned with fever. Not when a part of her still carried the memory of what it felt like to be left to die by people who thought you did not belong. The first day was clear. Low pale sun, frozen ground ringing under the sled runners, the dog, a sturdy caramel-colored mix named Tallow, pulling steady. The tundra stretched out in every direction, a blank canvas that hid its menace behind stillness. Laura traveled quickly, counting the landmarks her husband had marked months earlier. The forked juniper at Crow Creek, the tilted boulder shaped like a split skull, the dry wash where a flash flood had once carried off a wagon. By afternoon, clouds began to build on the northern horizon, not dark and threatening, but gray, featureless, almost apologetic. A plains wind picked up, not strong but steady, carrying the first fine grains of snow. Laura had seen storms before. This one did not look dangerous. It looked ordinary. That was its first trick. She pushed on into the evening, hopping to reach the half-dugout at mile marker 9, a crude shelter used by trappers. But the snow thickened faster than she expected, the light failing early behind a white curtain. Tallow began to whine low in his throat, not from cold but from an animal awareness of pressure dropping, of something large and hungry approaching. Laura stopped and considered turning back. But the Ashby cabin was closer now than her own, and her grandmother had once told her that indecision killed more travelers than storms ever did. So she pressed forward, tugging the sled line tighter, her fingers already numb inside her fleece-lined gloves. The world erased itself without warning. One moment, a smudge of horizon. The next, a wall of screaming white so dense Laura could not see Tallow 3 yards ahead. The wind, which had been a murmur, became a physical force, shoving her sideways, stealing her breath, packing snow into every fold of her clothing. The temperature dropped like a stone into a frozen well. Laura knew instantly this was not a squall. This was a full prairie whiteout, the kind that could last days, the kind that left men frozen upright in the saddle. She tried to steer the sled toward a windbreak she remembered, but her directions vanished. There was no up, no down, only a swirling gray bowl of blindness. Tallow stopped, refusing to pull. The sled skidded sideways and Laura stumbled into a drift up to her waist. She clawed herself out, gasping. No shelter, no fire. The heavy wool dress, the apron, the shawl, all soaked with melting snow. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones like a slow poison. For the first time, real fear squeezed her throat. Her mind raced through the ordinary solutions. Dig into the drift, maybe, but the snow was too loose, would collapse. Try to walk. She would wander in circles until her legs gave out. Build a linta from the sled. The wind would tear it apart. The Ashby family would not be saved now. And Laura realized with a terrible clarity that she had about 2 hours before the cold so confused her thinking that she would simply lie down and wait to die. Then, beneath the howl of the storm, she heard it. Her grandmother's voice, clear as if Anana were standing beside her. The earth will never shelter you, child, but snow remembers how to be stone. Laura looked at her sled, then at the carved wooden shotgun she had brought for wolves. The barrel was long, hollow, and suddenly it was not a weapon. It was a breathing tube. She unhitched Tallow, pulled the sled onto its side, and began to cut snow blocks with the blade of her hatchet. Not to keep the storm out, to bring the storm in, to build a tomb. And if her grandmother had been right, that tomb would become the only reason she would ever wake again. Laura worked with the same steady rhythm Anana had taught her years ago, not like someone racing a storm, but like someone weaving a basket one strand at a time. The whiteout screamed around her, ice crystals biting her face like shards of glass, but she kept her hands moving. The sled, tilted on its side, became the anchor. She packed hard snow around its base, then began cutting blocks from the deeper drift beside a wind-scoured hummock. The hatchet was small, a camp tool, but its edge bit cleanly through the compacted layers that had been hardened by the relentless prairie gales. She cut rectangular slabs, each as long as her forearm and twice as thick, stacking them in a tight ring around the sled to form the walls of her tomb. Tallow, the dog, huddled beside her, his thick coat already caked with snow. He did not whine anymore. He had entered that quiet state of endurance that animals know better than humans, conserving energy, trusting the human to lead. Laura pulled the wool shawl tighter across her face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. Her fingers were stiffening, but she did not stop. She remembered the precise words her grandmother had said, words that she had not spoken aloud in 20 years. Build walls that bow inward like a shoulder against the wind. Do not make them straight. A curved back breaks the force, and the snow itself becomes the mortar. Laura shaped the blocks accordingly, leaning each one slightly inward, pressing them together so the wind would fuse them into a single frozen shell. The real danger was not the cold, but the air. She knew that burying herself under snow without a breathing channel would trap carbon dioxide and suffocate her within hours. Her grandmother had shown her how to carve a small opening at the top of the dome, a fist-sized hole that would let stale breath escape while the outer drift sealed everything else. But Laura had an even better tool. The shotgun she had brought for protection was a single-barrel percussion piece, a heavy old thing that Elias had traded for a cord of wood. The barrel was hollow, slightly over a yard long, and could be detached from the stock. She unscrewed the barrel from the wooden fore-end, its metal so cold it burned her skin even through her gloves. If she could position it as a breathing tube through the snow wall, angled upward to prevent drifting snow from plugging the bore, she would have a reliable airway. A black iron lung, poking from a snow grave. Building the chamber took nearly 2 hours, though time lost all shape in the whiteout. Laura hollowed out the interior, scraping snow away from the sled's interior space, creating a low cavity just large enough for her to lie curled on her side with tallow pressed against her back. She dragged the musket and the hatchet inside, then sealed the entrance behind her with a final block, padding it smooth from within. The darkness was immediate, but so was the silence. Inside the snow dome, the screaming wind dropped to a dull, distant hum. The snow absorbed the noise, swallowing it the way a heavy blanket swallows a whisper. Laura could hear her own breath, loud and ragged, and Tallow's steady panting. She positioned the shotgun barrel at an angle, its muzzle protruding through the designated hole, and packed snow tightly around it to prevent a collapse. Then she waited. The temperature inside the shelter began to rise almost at once. Her grandmother had explained it. Fresh snow is mostly air, and air is a poor conductor of heat. A body, even a cold one, radiates enough warmth to raise the interior of a snow chamber by several degrees. Within 30 minutes, the space was no longer freezing. Laura's eyelashes, which had been crusted with ice, began to drip. Tallow stretched out along her side, his thick fur a living furnace. For the first time since the whiteout descended, Laura allowed herself to believe that she might not die tonight. But the storm was far from finished. Outside, the blizzard continued to batter the tundra, piling drift upon drift against her shelter. Snow accumulated over the breathing tube opening, and Laura had to periodically clear it by blowing sharply through the barrel, a task that left her lightheaded. She had no water, no food except a small pouch of dried venison meant for the Ashby children. She chewed a strip slowly, letting the salt and smoke coat her tongue, but she rationed the rest. Dehydration was as deadly as the cold, and the dry wind outside would only worsen it. Her grandmother had taught her that melting snow in your mouth works for a while, but the energy cost is high. She had no fire, no way to melt snow in quantity. She would have to depend on the moisture still trapped inside the snow walls, which would slowly sublimate and condense on the inner surface, giving her something to lick. That first night stretched into eternity. Laura did not sleep. She merely drifted between shivering and a strange, exhausted stillness. Every so often she would jerk awake to the sound of the storm's renewed fury, or to Tallow growling at nothing, his body tensing beside her. Her thoughts circled back to the settlement, to the faces of the women who had whispered when her grandmother walked past, the same faces that had now probably noticed her absence. Would they search? Would they wait until the storm cleared? Or would they simply assume she was lost, another foolish woman who had wandered beyond her place? The Ashby family, too, was out there, sick and dying, expecting a medicine that would never come. Laura felt a crushing guilt, but she could not afford to dwell on it. She was not surviving for a cause. She was surviving because that was what her grandmother had taught her to do. On the second day, she woke to a profound darkness. The breathing tube was completely buried. Panic seized her for a moment, but she forced calm, pushing the shotgun barrel upward with a few hard thrusts until she felt the plug of snow give way. Cold air, thin and sharp, rushed in. She sucked it greedily. The interior was now a cocoon of compacted snow, its walls glazed from her breath, smooth as polished bone. Tallow shifted and lapped at the icy surface, his tongue rough against the frost. Laura realized that if she stayed too long, the walls would continue to thicken from her own exhalations, sealing her in permanently. She needed to ventilate more often, even at the cost of losing warmth. By the third day, the storm outside had not relented. Laura's sense of time was fractured. She measured days by the thin light that filtered through the breathing hole during what she assumed was midday, a gray phantom of illumination. Her body was weakening. Hunger had become a hollow ache in her stomach, but thirst was worse. Her tongue felt thick, her lips cracked despite the moisture she scraped from the walls. She had begun to talk to Tallow, not in words of hope, but in fragments of memory. She told him about the summer Anana had shown her how to find cloudberries in the muskeg, how the tiny orange fruits tasted like honey in sunlight. She described the day her grandmother had stood in the middle of the settlement, fists clenched, after a trader had called her a savage witch, and how she had refused to cry. These memories were not comfort. They were a kind of reckoning. Laura saw now that she had spent years hiding that part of herself, burying the knowledge in a shallow grave. She had worn the settler dress, spoken the settler words, married a settler man, and never once corrected anyone who assumed she was just another white woman from the East. But hiding had not protected her. It had only made her weaker. The storm did not care about her disguise. The storm only cared whether she knew how to survive, and her grandmother had known. On the fourth day, the silence inside the snow chamber changed. The wind, which had been a constant, distant roar, began to fade. Laura held her breath, listening. The pressure of the storm was lifting. Tallow lifted his head, ears pricked. Through the breathing tube, she could hear a muffled stillness, the hush of a world exhausted after a long rage. The blizzard had finally passed, but that only meant she was now alone, buried under a landscape that would look completely unfamiliar, every landmark erased, the trail gone. She was too weak to walk out, and no one would know where to dig unless they stumbled upon the breathing tube protruding from the snow. She pushed weakly at the entrance block, but it had frozen solid, fused to the surrounding drift. She was entombed. The only access was the shotgun barrel, a thin pipe to the outside world. She could shout through it, but the sound would barely carry across the vast, empty tundra. She would have to wait for someone to come looking, to notice the dark metal tube poking from an otherwise featureless white field. And as the hours stretched, Laura faced the most terrifying thought of all. What if no one came? What if, after everything she had done, she had only exchanged a fast death for a slow one, buried alive in a shelter that had become her prison? On the fifth day, Laura stopped believing in rescue. The cold had settled deep into her bones, a dull ache that no longer shivered but simply lingered, like a low flame that refused to go out. Tallow had stopped lifting his head at every distant sound, his body pressed against her with a stillness that was both comfort and surrender. She had rationed the venison to slivers so thin they dissolved on her tongue before she could chew, and she had not eaten any of it in over a day. The moisture she licked from the walls was tainted with the taste of old snow, metallic and empty. She could no longer feel her toes. The shotgun barrel, her iron lung, had begun to ice over faster than she could clear it, forcing her to breathe in short, shallow pulls that left her dizzy. She knew the signs. Her grandmother had described them with the same clinical calm she used for weather patterns. First the confusion, then the drowsiness, then the dangerous warmth that spreads just before the end. Laura was already feeling warm. She recognized it as a lie. Outside, the tundra was a blank page. The blizzard had erased not just the trail but the very contours of the land, filling ravines, flattening hummocks, burying the forked juniper and the split-skull boulder under drifts that could hide a wagon. The sky was a pale, empty blue now, cloudless and cruel, and the sun threw a blinding glare across the endless white. Nothing moved. The only dark spot in the entire landscape was the tip of the shotgun barrel, a finger of black iron jutting from a mound of snow that could have been a rock or a dead animal or nothing at all. That small tube was Laura's only tether to the world of the living, and it was invisible to anyone who was not looking directly at it. 12 miles away, in the settlement, her absence had begun to curdle from concern into gossip. The trading post was the town's nervous system, and word spread faster than any horse could ride. A trapper named Mullins, a man with one eye and a disposition like rust, had stopped by the Ashby place on the fourth day and found them sick but alive, burning their last firewood, no sign of Laura. He backtracked along the trail, looking for tracks, and saw nothing but drifted snow. By the time he returned to the post, his report was grim. The woman had walked into the storm, he said, with the certainty of a man who had seen many people walk into storms and never return. The storekeeper, a dry Baptist named Pritchard, folded his hands on the counter and declared that the Lord had called the half-breed home. Others nodded. The same mouths that had once whispered about Anana now whispered about her granddaughter, and the judgment was the same. She had reached beyond her station, trusted in a savage's wisdom, and the wilderness had swallowed her for it. But not everyone agreed. A quiet young carpenter named Jonas, who had once bought a healing salve from Laura for an infected cut and watched it work within a day, saddled his horse and began gathering a search party. He found resistance. The old men at the livery stable said it was wasted effort, that the body would not be found until spring, that any horse sent out now would only come back lame from breaking through the crust. But Jonas insisted. He had listened to Laura once describe the way her grandmother could read the snow like a book, and something in that memory would not leave him alone. He assembled 4 other men, reluctant volunteers, and they set out toward the Tundra trail on the morning of the 5th day, their horses plunging through drifts, their faces set against the wind. They expected to find a body. They were not prepared for what they actually found. For the first several hours they saw nothing. The whiteout had so thoroughly transformed the basin that even experienced men lost their bearings. The tilted boulder was gone. The dry wash had become a smooth plain. They split up, calling Laura's name into the silence, hearing only the echo of their own voices. The horses grew nervous, shying at phantom shapes. By midday the search was unraveling. One of the men, a farmer named Cobb, argued that they were wasting daylight and would be caught by another storm if they did not turn back. Jonas refused. He urged his horse deeper into the white wilderness, scanning every rise, every depression, looking for something, anything that did not belong. Tallow heard them first. The dog's ears pricked, a low whine escaping his throat, and Laura, drifting in a fog of exhaustion, did not respond. Tallow whined again, louder, his body tensing, and then he began to scratch at the frozen entrance block with a desperate, frantic energy. The sound cut through Laura's stupor. She reached out, her fingers clumsy, and felt the dog's ribs heaving. Outside, faint and far, she heard what he had heard, a voice calling her name. It was so distant she thought she imagined it, a phantom sound conjured by a dying brain. But Tallow was not imagining. He barked, a sharp, high-pitched alarm that echoed through the tiny chamber, and Laura, with the last of her strength, pushed herself toward the breathing tube. She put her mouth to the cold iron and shouted. Her voice was a croak, barely more than a whisper. She tried again and again, each cry scraping her throat like sand. The men on horseback did not hear her, but they heard the dog. A faint, persistent barking that seemed to come from nowhere, from the snow itself. Jonas halted, held up a hand for silence. The barking continued, muffled but real, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Jonas dismounted, waded through the deep snow toward the sound, and nearly stumbled over the shotgun barrel. He stared at it for a long moment, a black pipe sticking out of a drift, steam rising faintly from its bore. Then he understood. He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, shouting for the others. They crowded around, shovel blades flashing, and as they cut into the snow dome, a hole opened and a rush of warm, stale air escaped, smelling of dog and desperation. A hand reached out, thin and pale, and grasped Jonas's wrist with a grip that was stronger than any dead woman. Laura was alive, but the moment of rescue was not the end of the trial. The frontier was a place that punished failure and suspicion almost as readily as it rewarded grit. As the men wrapped Laura in blankets and poured lukewarm tea from a canteen, they began to piece together what she had done, and the understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. She had built a snow house. An igloo, they called it, a word they only knew from sailors' tales of the Arctic, a savage thing. Yet this savage thing had kept her alive for 6 days when a white Christian woman would have frozen solid. The same men who had never spoken a kind word to her grandmother now stood in silence, their shovels dripping, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing. It was a reckoning none of them were ready to face. Laura, barely conscious, whispered for the Ashby family. She had not forgotten. The herbs, she said, still in the sled. Jonas found the small oilcloth pouch, its contents dry and intact. He promised he would deliver it himself. Then, as they lifted her onto a makeshift travois, one of the men, Cobb, the same farmer who had argued to turn back, noticed something. He was looking at the interior of the snow chamber, the curved walls, the careful bowing inward, the breathing hole engineered from a gun barrel. He had spent 20 years on the frontier, and he had never seen anything like it. He turned to Jonas, his face pale. "Her grandmother taught her this," he said quietly. "The old woman we all called crazy." The words hung in the frozen air like a verdict. And that was when the story turned inside out. Because what had saved Laura was not just ancient knowledge. It was a knowledge that the entire settlement had actively despised, a legacy they had tried to bury with Anana in a grave marked by a cross she never wanted. The snow coffin, as they would later call it, was not a sign of savagery. It was a monument to a wisdom that had been right there among them for years, ignored and ridiculed. And now, a woman they had considered a fool for venturing into the storm had returned from the dead carrying that wisdom on her back, impossible to deny. The question that would rip through the community in the days to come was one they were not prepared to answer. If the savage ways were so wrong, why was Laura alive and their own prayers had been useless? The cart that carried Laura back into the settlement rolled through the main street on the morning of the 6th day, its wooden wheels creaking under a human weight that had no right to still be breathing. She lay wrapped in a buffalo robe, her face chapped raw, her fingers still curled in the shape of the hatchet she had held through the long dark. Jonas walked beside the horse, his own hands blistered from the digging, his face set in a quiet, almost reverent exhaustion. People gathered on the porches of the mercantile and the livery, not cheering, not weeping, simply staring. The same faces that had already mourned her now watched her pass like a ghost who had refused to stay buried. The storekeeper Pritchard stood in his doorway, his thin mouth pressed tight, his Bible still tucked under one arm. He said nothing. There was nothing to say, not yet. The proof was still breathing. They took Laura to the widow Crane's house, the only woman in the settlement who knew how to treat frostbite without amputating fingers. The widow undressed her gently, examined the white, bloodless toes, and shook her head not in refusal but in disbelief. The damage was minimal. Only 2 toes on the left foot showed the deep purple blisters that signaled dead tissue, but the rest had survived. She had kept the blood moving by pressing her feet against Tallow's belly, the dog's warmth a crude but effective furnace. The widow poured warm water, not hot, over the frozen skin and muttered over and over that this should have killed her, that this had killed stronger men, that something about that snow grave had saved her. Laura did not correct her. She simply closed her eyes and slept, and the widow spread another quilt over her legs and let her be. The Ashby family did not die. Jonas rode out himself that same afternoon, following the trail markers Laura had tried to reach before the storm swallowed them. He found the cabin half buried, the children huddled beneath a single bearskin, the mother so weak she could barely lift her head. He boiled the herbs in creek water, the same pouch of willow bark and unnamed root that Anana had prepared years earlier, and he spooned the bitter liquid into their mouths. By the following dawn, the fever had broken. The youngest boy, a child of 4 who had been delirious for 3 days, sat up and asked for bread. The father, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks, took Jonas's hand and wept. The news traveled back to the settlement before Jonas did, carried by a passing trapper who saw the Ashby chimney smoking cleanly for the first time in a week. Laura had not only saved herself, she had, by extension, saved 5 others. The herbs that the white doctors had dismissed, as native superstition had done what prayer and waiting had not. And now the settlement had to confront a truth it had spent decades burying. For years, Anana had been a tolerated ghost, allowed to exist on the margins because she was quiet and useful in ways that did not threaten. She had delivered bobbies, treated wounds, and predicted storms with a casual accuracy that the settlers had always attributed to animal instinct rather than intelligence. She had never been thanked. She had never been paid. She had simply been there, and when she died, the town had buried her in a corner of the churchyard with a wooden marker that warped in the first rain and became illegible. Now her granddaughter had crawled out of the snow carrying that same knowledge like a torch, and the torch would not be extinguished. The question that hung over the settlement was not whether Anana had been right. It was why they had needed a young woman to nearly die before they would believe it. Cobb, the farmer who had argued to turn the search party back, was the first to break. He appeared at the widow's door on the 7th day, hat in hand, his face creased with a shame that had kept him awake through the night. He asked to speak to Laura, and when she received him, still wrapped in blankets beside the hearth, he could barely meet her eyes. He told her that he had once laughed when Anana predicted a late spring freeze, and then the freeze had killed half his lambs. He had blamed bad luck. He had blamed God. He had blamed everything except his own refusal to listen. Now he asked Laura if she would teach him what she knew. Not to become a native, he added quickly, as if the word still frightened him, but to survive. Laura studied him for a long moment and then she nodded. Not for him, but for her grandmother. The lessons would begin when she could stand. That spring, something unprecedented happened on the edges of the settlement. A small group gathered behind Laura's cabin, not in secret but openly. Cobb was there, his hands clumsy but patient. Jonas, the carpenter, came too, his practical mind fascinated by the structural logic. A few women, wives of farmers and traders, stood with their arms crossed, skeptical but curious. Laura led them into the last patch of lingering snow, a deep drift still cradled in the shade of the cottonwoods, and she taught them how to build the protecting hollow. She showed them how to cut blocks, how to angle the walls inward, how to leave a breathing hole and seal the rest. She did not speak of her grandmother's spirit or her people's traditions, not yet. She spoke only of snow density and wind shear and the thermal properties of trapped air. She spoke the language of survival, and that was the language the settlers understood. The children, quicker to forget prejudice, began to call the shelters Laura's caves, and they built tiny versions in the drifts behind the schoolhouse. One afternoon, the teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Drummond, found her class outside instead of at their desks, crouched inside a miniature dome, and instead of scolding them, she asked them to explain how it worked. The next week, she asked Laura to give a demonstration for the whole school. Standing before 20 children, some of whom had once thrown pebbles at her grandmother's window, Laura described the science of snow and the wisdom of the Inuit, and she did not flinch from using the word Inuit. The children listened, and for the first time, the knowledge began to feel like it belonged in this place, not as a foreign intrusion, but as a gift that had always been waiting to be received. But the transformation was not complete, and Laura knew it. There were still men in the settlement who refused to acknowledge her. Pritchard, the storekeeper, still called the snow shelter a heathen trick and warned his congregation that no amount of cleverness could replace a righteous life. A few ranchers still spat when they passed the little cabin where Anana had once lived, and Laura understood that her survival had not erased the hatred. It had only forced it into the shadows. The difference now was that she was no longer hiding. She wore her grandmother's beaded pendant openly, a small circle of bone and sinew that Anana had worn against her skin until the day she died. She hung it around her neck and let the settlers see it. It was not a threat. It was a declaration that the knowledge had a source, and that source was worthy of honor. The final surprise came in the autumn of that year, when an old leather-bound journal surfaced in the bottom of a trunk at the trading post. It had belonged to the settlement's founder, a man named Harlan, who had died 10 years before Anana ever arrived. The journal had been kept in a locked box and forgotten. When the storekeeper's son found it and opened it out of idle curiosity, he discovered a passage dated to the winter of 1853, decades before the settlement had even been named. Harlan had been traveling alone along the same tundra trail, caught in a storm remarkably similar to the one that had trapped Laura. He had been rescued by an Inuit woman who had built him a snow shelter, warmed him with her own furs, and led him to safety. He described her as a heathen angel, and he wrote that he would never speak of her for fear of being shamed. He kept the story locked in that trunk for the rest of his life. The woman's name was never mentioned, but the description matched what little the old trappers remembered of Anana's own mother. The knowledge had been saving settlers long before the settlement existed. They simply had refused to remember. The discovery broke something open in the community. It was one thing to suspect that they had been wrong. It was another to hold written proof in the hand of their own founder that the very thing they had mocked had once saved the man who built their church. The journal was read aloud at a town meeting, and when the last line was finished, the silence was so deep that even the wind outside seemed to pause. Laura sat in the back of the room, tallow at her feet, and she did not smile or cry or speak. She simply listened. And when the meeting ended, several people approached her, not with apologies but with questions. Practical questions. How to read the snow, how to build the shelter, how to survive. She answered them all patiently, thoroughly, the way her grandmother had once answered a small girl with dark eyes who had never been afraid of the cold. The frontier, at last, was learning to listen. But listening is a slow process, and not everyone was ready. Even after the journal surfaced, even after Laura's snow shelter design was copied by half the homesteads in the basin, there were still those who refused to admit that an illiterate Inuit woman had saved more lives than the town doctor. Some people will always choose comfort over truth. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface of the community, something that could not be taken back. Every winter from that year forward, a few more travelers carried the knowledge of the protecting hollow with them across the tundra. Laura taught anyone who asked, and she never asked for payment. She simply made them promise one thing, that they would remember her grandmother's name. Anana. It meant blessed mother in her own language, a meaning no one in the settlement had ever bothered to learn. Now it was spoken openly, carved into a new stone marker Laura placed over the old grave, and repeated around hearth fires when the wind screamed at the windows. The knowledge that had once been a whispered secret between a grandmother and her granddaughter had finally become common wisdom, not because the frontier had become more virtuous, but because survival itself had forced the truth into the light. And that truth reveals something uncomfortable about the way we measure intelligence. For centuries, we have told ourselves that civilization moves in one direction, that the old ways vanish because they are weaker. But on that tundra trail, in the heart of a whiteout that erased every mark of human pride, it was the old way that triumphed. The snow coffin was not a relic. It was a solution, engineered by a culture the settlers had never tried to understand. Laura survived because she had the humility to listen when she was a child, the courage to remember when she was a woman, and the strength to act when the storm arrived. But the shadow lingering behind her story is this. How many other Ananas have there been before and since, whose knowledge died with them because no one bothered to stoop down and learn? How many other snow shelters were never built? How many lives lost because someone decided that a dark-skinned woman could not possibly have anything to teach? The tundra is still there, patient and indifferent, and the blizzards still sweep down from the northern ridge with the same sudden violence. The shotgun barrel Laura used as her breathing tube was found years later, rusted into the ruins of the old shelter, and a young boy brought it to the trading post as a curiosity. By then, everyone knew what it meant, and they handled it with a reverence that would have seemed unthinkable just one winter earlier. Laura herself lived into her 70s, teaching survival workshops to the children of the same men who had once called her grandmother a witch. And on the day she died, the settlement held a funeral that was not a grudging concession but a genuine outpouring of grief. They buried her beside Anana under a shared stone, and the epitaph read simply, "They trusted the snow." That stone still stands, though the settlement itself has long since faded, and if you walk the old trail in the winter months, you might still find the buried outline of that first snow coffin beneath the drifts. The question we are left with is not about survival alone. It is about what we lose when we refuse to see the intelligence standing right in front of us, wrapped in the wrong clothes, speaking the wrong tongue, daring to know something we never learned. Every frontier has its storms, and every generation faces its own whiteout. The question is whether we will have the humility to learn from the people we have been taught to ignore, or whether we will freeze to death clutching our own certainty. Laura chose differently. She trusted the snow, and the snow held her. And that is a truth no amount of civilization can erase. Subscribe now to witness the stories that history forgot, the survivors who defied every expectation, and the ancient knowledge that still waits, silent and patient, for those willing to listen.